This is Truth Frequency Radio.
No hate, no hype, no fear. Real people, real radio.
Hello and welcome to Enemy Within, going out live on truthfrequencyradio.com, 10th of October 2015. Good morning if you're listening in the States or that area of the globe. Today we're joined again by our high-level financial insider, Paul. Hello, Paul.
Good afternoon, Tom. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you.
You wanted to do it a little bit differently today and focus on Russia and China and the paradigm.
Yeah, well, I think I was looking at saying, well, okay, we've discussed a lot in the past about the problems in the West, and they're well documented and well catalogued about the financial system, and people are often looking at the West as the sort of focal point of what's going on, where in fact, evidently, and we see all the time, what the real changes coming out of Russia and China and nations like that, where the new paradigm will be born, the shift's going from west to east. And it probably is worthwhile at this point to reflect a little bit more on what's going on in both those nations in relation to developments, and that will hopefully give people a bit more of an insight as to what is actually going on, as opposed to saying, well, I don't see anything happening in the West. Well, that's not really entirely surprising, given that the West is really now taking the back seat and is no longer really making decisions globally, as we can discuss when we start to kick off with what Russia are doing currently.
Yeah, the focus in the mainstream media and in the alternative media at the minute is the situation with Russia, obviously because of the air raids, the bombing in Syria at the moment. I don't know what you make of Russia's move to actually take out ISIS and all of these other rebel groups.
Well, yeah, I think predominantly we can start off by saying that Russia have very recently decided to undertake a military offensive. Now, as ever, I had someone asking me a question, was it perfect timing? Well, this is less to do with about perfect timing. It's more to do with why did Russia decide to engage militarily in Syria? I mean, it's obvious that Assad has been an ally of Russia, and vice versa, for a considerable period of time, given Putin averted probably a major international incident in that region a couple of years ago. So, but obviously, Russia undertook to take military action with devastating consequences for ISIS or ISIL or whatever other name they go by currently. We know apparently now it's about 50% of the targets that they've earmarked have been destroyed. A lot of its infrastructure and the capability to communicate with each other, which has resulted in massive desertions from ISIS, obviously operatives who've said, well, they've seen what's happened and gone, we're not going to partake in this war anymore, because we clearly are now against an opposition who are hell-bent on destroying us. And by all accounts, Russian intelligence is so good that they know every single operative who's out there, where they are, and even if they run away from the scene of the battle, they will track them down wherever they are in the world, with devastating consequences for those people. But I think we should point out that as much as this is happening, all wars are hugely regrettable, but unfortunately this is an inevitable consequence of Western cabal influence in the Middle East and trying to foment destruction and death and grand larceny, as they always do, as I call the unholy trinity. And what we have seen as a consequence is that Russia are targeting with pinpoint accuracy, which is waking up the world to the fact that, even though many people would not like me to say this, Russia's military technology is light years ahead of anything the West had. And they were able to target everything accurately. There was no civilian casualties, no hospitals accidentally bombed, which seems to be something that the Americans do with regularity. And when I say the Americans, I'm not talking about American people, let's be clear. This is a military that is controlled by the Western cabal, and they are not to be held responsible directly. They are merely carrying out orders and doing what they're told to do. And I think the US military are increasingly fed up with their role they've played in not only Syria, but Afghanistan and Iraq. So the consequence was that we will see this ongoing activity of Russian involvement in Syria with the view to removing ISIL in its entirety. But it won't stop there. We're already seeing that Iraq is going to share intel with Iran, Russia, Syria and China. They want those influences removed from their country. And we've also this week seen Afghanistan, which is ironic given Russia's involvement in Afghanistan in the war in the late 70s, have now said to Russia, please come and deal with the problem in our country and remove the Taliban, who we know are also Western financed, trained and backed. So this has been a significant development in a very short space of time. And essentially Russia said to the US, get out of Syria, do what you're doing, and the Americans have said, okay, we're going. And there's been an announcement that they're curtailing the budget to train, in inverted commas, moderate opposition, etc., etc. So America is backing them. Now, whether we may see America become involved in a capacity that's supportive rather than claiming, oh, we're actually dealing with the problem, when, in fact, they had most bombing raids never destroyed anything. And that was obviously by design. It was tokenism to make the world feel, oh, well, America's trying to target this war on terror, when in fact they weren't trying to target anything except the removal of Assad in Syria in this example, or Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
Well, that was exactly the point that I was going to say. It's Russia's involvement now is making a mockery of the Western campaign, the bombing campaigns that they've carried out. It's kind of like, what have you been doing all this time? Because the progress that Russia's made over a matter of, a week to going 2 weeks is incredible compared to months and months of these operations apparently taking out ISIS.
Well, I think the quote was that Russia did more in 72 hours than the Western Alliance had done in 3.5 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found it really interesting there, Paul, that when this first happened, Russia started intervening, it was reported on mainstream news stations and websites that Russia had started bombing ISIS, and then a couple of hours later it suddenly changed to, oh no, they're not bombing ISIS, they're bombing the Free Syrian Army. So they obviously didn't read the script before they put the news out there.
Well, yes, and of course that's the usual problem, that everything's scripted and telegraphed down to the mainstream news that people watch every day and believe is reporting the truth. And that's a whole separate subject area in itself, but it's something people in the West need to increasingly be aware of, that the mainstream media does not report objectively. It reports what it's told. And this is why we see this incredible synchronicity between numerous supposedly independent news sources who literally say everything identically word for word. And anyone who pays the slightest bit of attention to that will be completely aware that that's been the case for as long as I can remember. Pay less attention to what the media is telling you and look at what is actually happening. And if the West was really serious about this war on terror, it would have dealt with the problem of ISIS and ISIL quite easily. It would have never have allowed it to grow and expand as fast as it did while it stood back and apparently did nothing. I mean, and then there's the argument, well, we need to have UN resolutions and agreements. Well, they ignored UN resolutions and went into Iraq and partake in an illegal war there. So all these arguments don't hold any water whatsoever, and you're absolutely right, it makes a mockery of the West and their apparent desire to deal with a war on terror that they've created in its entirety. And now we're seeing how Russia said enough's enough. But the timing, I think, is hugely significant. I suspect it may be part of a far bigger series of events that are ongoing. I mean, we only have to look at the participation of Iran. Iran is going to send military forces in, and its intelligence. Iraq's participating in that capacity. We spoke on the last show how China was sending a fleet into the Middle East. I've actually been told apparently China's had a presence in the Mediterranean for 12 months, which kind of is clearly indicative of the fact that the Chinese influence has been there a lot longer than most people realise. So we then come back to the next point of, well, what reaction are we seeing to this, apart from the reaction of the mainstream media misreporting what's actually going on? We've seen already that the EU Commission head Juncker said, we must improve relations with Russia, we must get things on a better footing. It's incredible how Russia doesn't flex its muscles so much, but says we're dealing with a major problem we have in the Middle East. And the European Commission's immediately backtracking and trying to say, we better appease Russia and improve relations. We saw the US climb down over Syria and the cessation of operations and the apparent budgets to train the moderate opposition, etc. And interestingly, Luxembourg's a huge financial centre in Europe and across the world, even though it's not part of the European Union. And they've set up a financial platform for operation in rubles. That was announced this week. Mm-hmm. And that's hugely significant. They want to essentially set up some specialised funds, creating the opportunity for these parallel and cross funds, both in Moscow and Luxembourg, but also not just with Russian money, but also international capital. And this is partly believed to be a reaction to this ongoing fiasco of sanctions against Russia, which no one in Europe believes anymore has any benefit to dealing with this apparent Russian problem in Ukraine, which of course is nonsense. It's actually been hugely damaging to Europe. And we are increasingly seeing more and more evidence, not explicitly, of nations saying, we've had enough of this. It's hugely damaging. And we can talk about Germany a little bit later and some developments there, particularly in relation to the Bundesbank and gold this week. But we're also seeing increasingly other nations in Europe starting to say, we've had enough. These sanctions are doing no damage to anyone but us. And Russia has just diversified its trade and business model to escape this problem. So, well, if you don't want to trade with us, fine, we'll go and trade with these other nations for goods and services, and you can end up having no goods and services. And, when the sanctions stop, don't expect us to come back and work with you. And that's had devastating consequences for all nations, not just particularly Germany, who has thousands of companies in Russia, and obviously vice versa. There's Russian investment in Germany. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, or was, until these ridiculous sanctions were imposed in relation to Ukraine, which everyone, I think, pretty much now realises that Ukraine had nothing to do with Russia. It was yet another Western-backed attempt to overthrow a democratic, whether you like it, they were democratically elected. The Ukraine people said, we want this as a government. They were overthrown because it was an attempt to destabilise Russia, with consequences that nothing has transpired in that capacity. And in fact, if anything, it was a kind of precursor to accelerate the type of events we're talking about now in relation to Russia, and obviously we can talk about in relation to China as well.
Paul, I've just got a question that's cropped up here in the People's Intellect Radio chat room. Welcome to everyone on PIR, and hopefully we'll be coming out on 2:00 slot on a Saturday afternoon on a regular basis from now on. Rob Freeman asks, question for Paul. Does he acknowledge that all countries are now corporations and thus any conflicts are really of a commercial interest for profit and not for the living people of any country?
Typically, are all nations corporations? Well, Western nations perhaps, certainly not Eastern nations. And this is where this divorce has come between the corporate interest of the West and what we're seeing now where Russia's going. We're going into Syria to deal with a problem. This isn't about a corporate or a commercial interest for us. We see this as a huge problem. We need to deal with it and address it. The thing is with this whole idea, yes, of this corporatism of the Western nations, we're now actually starting to see that these big corporations are suffering hugely, financially, and also are incapable now of functioning as the corporations. Well, this corporatism is dying. I know there's this recent announcement of the TPP. Oh, well, we've now got these nations working with the US. Well, it has been ratified. It won't be ratified until 2016, and by then it won't even happen. And how do you have these trans-Pacific partnerships without China involved? It's absolutely farcical. They carry no clout. It's all hot air and window dressing. It's all designed to give everyone the impression it's business as usual with the West. Well, it isn't business as usual. So yes, corporatism does exist in the West that does purely serve the interests of, you can call it 1%, it's not even 1%. But that it will increasingly change, but the move that's going to change it is not so much what the West is going to do and how it's going to deal with the problem, because we're not really, don't seem capable of dealing with the problem. It's going to come from actions in the East which will force consequences through those actions to Western nations, and then it will become really apparent to everyone who doesn't know anything's even happening that, hang on, we have major problems. It's going to be what I refer to now as 2008 on steroids, basically, times a factor of a million, whatever you want to do. It will have financial consequences that will be quite severe. Who knows exactly what's going to happen? I don't hold this dystopian view of World War III. World War III will not happen. Doesn't matter who thinks. They've tried it. The amount of times they've tried to start wars in the last few years and have failed every time. Now there's reasons for that. And it's not going to change. That position's clear. They will try conflict. But we're seeing what Russia's now doing in Syria is proving that there's been a dynamic shift away from the Western influence militarily to try and dictate it in the Middle East, which is done for a decade. And that's moving away now, and Russia's saying, with the support of China, with the support of Iran, and these are grown nations. Iran's going to be hugely significant in the future. It has massive resources, it has a young population, an educated nation. Yeah, people will argue, I don't like the government, I don't like what the regime does. Well, how much of that's a reality and how much of it isn't is debatable. I can't really tell you. But Iran will play a significant part, and there's no doubt the climb down over the nuclear talks with the US was in part a recognition of that, but also because the US thinks it can cozy up to Iran now. Well, Iran's not stupid, it's not going to fall for those games. These nations are far too wise to history, which has shown at every end and turn. Iran won't forget how they were engaged in an engineered Iran-Iraq war to destabilize both nations. It realizes that there was an attempt to start World War III with Iran. And then the list goes on. These nations don't forget what's happened to them, and they're not going to suddenly climb down and go, oh yes, it's mutually beneficial for us to have partnership with the US. Quite the contrary, it realizes that it needs to build strong relationships with Russia and China, which it already has had relationships, more so probably in the past with Russia and Iran than China and Iran. But we're going to see the growth of these relationships more and more. So, yes, the corporatism of the West has been there, but it's on the wane, and you will start to see other layman events happen, where, in fact, layman's was a sacrificial lamb. In this case, there won't be sacrificial lambs. You'll see major institutions and corporations will fold and collapse because financially they're bankrupt. There's no other way to put it.
Would you not describe the situation that we're in and the situations that we've been in before in proxy wars elsewhere as that being World War III? Everybody always talks about World War III as being a nuclear war, some confrontation with Russia, but you look at how many countries are involved and have been involved for some time, you would probably describe it as World War III.
In a sense, yeah, but I think the World War III was more financial. I mean, we certainly have seen evidence of that since before 2000. I mean, from the advent of derivatives, that was a financial war that was destined to end in catastrophic failure. we saw the serious problem that happened in 2008, which wasn't cabal engineered, quite the contrary. The cabal made some very bad decisions, and China said, well, we want our gold returned. They refused, so China dumped mortgage bonds, which caused the subprime crisis, which caused the catalytic event for the financial collapse. So, yeah, there's clear evidence. I would say it was more a financial war. But yeah, I mean, if you look, people talk about the world's never been so peaceful since World War II, but think of every war that's happened in that period. There's been huge amounts of war. But I think you're absolutely right, Tom, but there's also the side to it that says, well, people often think World War III means nuclear catastrophe and it's Armageddon and it's the end of the world and we're all going to be blown up. And, well, that absolutely is never going to happen.
And you're totally spot on about the financial war. There's no bigger financial war than what was waged on the EU, through the EU, and basically a fire sale afterwards.
Yes, of course, the European Union is a farce because it was set up illegally. Nations, they fudged all these currency swaps and hid all the financial debt, which would, if you read the small print, it said, well, these nations are not fit for purpose. They can't join the European Union. But of course, they were railroaded into the European Union. And of course, yeah, it was give people lots of cheap credit. When you know full well they can't repay, then you start to asset strip nations and steal all their assets. But we're back to death, destruction, and grand larceny. I mean, it's written all over history of that unholy trinity of cabal activity. And they've done it forever and a day, and they will not be continuing to do it for that much longer. But yeah, of course, the European Union was just a gigantic experiment because, let's face it, what did Hitler want to do in Europe? It was centralized control, probably one currency, would have been the Deutschmark. That failed, and people don't look back in history and go, hang on, what's the difference now apart from the fact we don't have military intervention on that scale in individual countries? But you don't need to fight a military war to dominate and control nations, and of course it's just a financial war in Europe to control nations and asset strip them and destroy every nation eventually. And if things were allowed to carry on to their natural conclusion, even Germany would once again, for the third time in 100 years, be plunged into financial and economic chaos.
I was watching the EU Parliament, and there's been some very nervous speeches from the French and the Germans and other countries talking about leaving the EU. It seems, well, we've been talking for some time about the inevitable collapse of the EU, but it seems like it's on a fast track at the minute. Yes,
we're back to this point where we talked about just a few minutes ago about the sanctions and how nations are fed up and sick and tired of the ramifications of invoking those sanctions. But yeah, nations have had enough. I mean, without labouring too much on the point of this whole immigration, but I think we've seen Slovakia this week saying they're threatening to walk away from the EU because of immigration policy. I think you'll increasingly see more and more nations are now going. It was one thing for you to come in and have lots of cheap credit, cheap finance for your 1%, but you're now starting to really destroy our nations, and enough's enough. And because they're now getting a lot of pressure behind the scenes from political parties, from lawmakers, from commerce, even in small nations. But Germany, particularly, the backlash is privately is significant and has been for a period of time. And this is why we're starting to see Merkel make odd comments. People go, well, it's lip service. Well, partly yes, but partly no. There's a realization that Germany now, amongst lawmakers and commerce, know that if something's not done, Germany will be destroyed again. And they do privately, a lot of the lawmakers and the commerce want to be part of this Eurasian axis, which is Germany, Russia and China. And there's always been this desire by the cabal to destroy that link between Germany and Russia. And you only have to look back through history and see we had the Russian Revolution for that very purpose. We had World War I, which destroyed Germany. And then they had the Versailles Treaty, which meant World War II was inevitable. Hitler was bankrolled by the West, that's proven. There was an article in The Guardian back in 2004, which is a UK major broadsheet newspaper that basically said, yeah, that a relative of the Bushes was behind a bank that financed Hitler into power and took Germany from the brink of collapse into an economically strong nation in a period of time which is impossible unless there was some serious financial backing. So Germany's beginning to realise that it's been a pawn, and whether people like it or not, Merkel's a Washington cabal asset. That's inevitable, just by her language, by the things she says. But the whole thing that happened with Ukraine when there was a meeting with Merkel, Hollande, and Putin. Putin said a number of things that probably in history we'll find out one day was hugely significant. What was said, I don't know what was said to be honest, but they both went away and their view of the world and how the world operated and what was going on and what was to come became a lot more crystal clear in their minds. And I hope one day history records what was said, because it will be hugely interesting to know what he said to them. But I think that was a defining point where a lot of the doubt started to surface, and I suspect something was said along the lines, you do realise you're all just puppets. You're all just part of a game, and they'll destroy all of you in the end.
Yep,
take all your assets.
We're just going to break. We'll be back. This is Enemy Within on truthfrequencyradio.com.
Chris and Sheree Gio here, founders of Truth Frequency Radio. We just wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for making TFR the biggest and the best independent radio station out there.
When we first entered the alternative media scene in 2009, we were really taken aback by the amount of infighting, backbiting, fear-based reporting, and ego-driven personalities. That's when we knew we had to set ourselves apart and set a new standard in broadcasting. And thus, TFR was conceived as a listener-supported station with no corporate or outside influence and limited commercial interruptions.
You can support our efforts by signing up for a VIP membership at truthfrequencyradio.com/signup or by making a donation at truthfrequencyradio.com/donate.
For less than $4 a month, you can ensure that TFR continues broadcasting for years to come. Real people, real radio.
Wherever you are, make it TFR.
Hey, Big Mouth. Yeah, you. Listen, I want you to put the word out on the street. Tell your coworkers, your family, your paisanos that my good friend, Joe Joseph, is doing a good thing here. He's sticking his neck out for me, for Sil, and for all the people in the world. Isn't that right, Sil?
He's part of the family now, T.
That's what I thought. So tune into him right here on Freedom Link, Monday through Friday, exclusively on the Truth Frequency Radio. Yeah, they're watching you. Big deal. They're watching me too. They're watching everybody. So grow some cojones and give them something to watch and listen to. Make them earn it. Give them paperwork until they choke. That's right. I know you won't let me down. So you're gonna put the word out about my good friend, Joe Joseph, right? Good. Now do me a favor and get out of here.
Hey you. Yeah, you. You like listening to podcasts, don't you? Have you ever thought about starting a podcast of your own? If you're a hardcore podcast fan, you probably have, and you've probably got something great to share with the world. I'm Nathan Frazier, and I've created a free online podcasting course for people just like you. Pre-Launch Secrets gives you the top 5 secrets you need to know in order to launch a successful podcast. You'll learn how to create the core concept of your podcast, how to build a solid audience, and how to consistently generate great content for that audience. These are the secrets the pros use when coming up with ideas for their podcasts. And after this course, you'll have them all at your disposal. The course is free. It's taught by me. Enroll today. Go to podcastblastoff.com/course. That's podcastblastoff.com/course. Podcast Blastoff, the future of podcasting.
Exposing faux capitalism with Jason Erm. Saturday on Truth Frequency Radio.
Welcome back to Enemy Within on truthfrequencyradio.com. With our guest today, our resident financial insider, Paul. Just before the break, you were talking about the meeting between Merkel and Putin over the Ukraine, and you were talking about how we one day might find out what was actually said in that, because it's very important. Because, like you were saying, he basically just laid it out and said, hang on a minute, you're all being used as pawns.
Yeah, and I actually, even though people will say I cannot believe these people don't realise this was happening, I actually genuinely think a lot of them don't. The reason they are put in power, which they're groomed into positions over a long period of time, is they're conditioned not to think that they are in fact, pawns or puppets. They're conditioned to believe they're important and they're fulfilling some great role and of significance. But in fact, in reality, there comes a realization moment for some of them, and sometimes it happens when they've long since, retired from office. But sometimes, in the case, I think Putin pointed out a few home truths, that they would have gone home and gone, hang on a minute, we've got to face the reality of this. Now, obviously, they can't just flip-flop and U-turn at a moment's notice, because the risk, of course, is you do that to your masters and there are serious consequences for you. But I think we are seeing evidence coming out of Germany and France of this idea that enough's enough. And, of course, the weaker the US appears to be on a world stage, eventually the nations will start to go, well, we can be a bit stronger now and more forthright in how we deal with problems and deal with matters, because there is this balance of power shift away from the cabal and not to a balance of power shift in the sense that Russia, China want to dominate the world. They don't. They're not interested in that. They want a world that's built on mutual cooperation, understanding, and a desire for nations to work together for the betterment of everyone, not the Western idea or the US hegemony of, if you don't do what we say, we'll destroy you, with consequences. And sadly, we always have to come back to this point. This is not about the US people. This has nothing to do with that. And denigrating the US people is ridiculous and stupid and in fact incredibly ignorant of the situation. This is about a small minority who control Washington, who control the military for their ends and no one else's. This is not in the interest of the American people. They don't care about the American people. They never have and they never will. There is a nation of 300 million people that post the fall of the cabal, there's going to be a period of time where there will be unrest. It will be very, very difficult for nations to operate economically, financially, politically, and socially. But nations like the US can be reborn into the nation they should have always been. And I do believe one day that will happen. When and how long? Well, that depends on a lot of circumstances, but it also depends on the American people realizing what's being done to them as a nation and saying, we have, because there is a lot of great people there who can rebuild the nation, and it's important, and it's not just goes for America, it goes for all of Western nations, but also the Eastern nations. But they've already been doing this. Russia's been working hard for a long time to address the problems they have. The same in China. We can talk about a little bit about China in more detail shortly. And it's this realization that by building alliances with other nations, it builds respect and trust between them. And they can work for mutually beneficial reasons and not the idea that we have to control everyone else. But that is not how nations would operate normally. But we've been conditioned to believe that that's a normal way to do things. But that's because of a cabal that controls everything. They control corporations, they control the media, they control the way we think and perceive and understand reality. But even our history is largely an illusion. And one day we'll get to learn what the real history is. And that will be important. It will be very shocking for people. But we do need to address this because, more importantly, this is about building a world that we never have this problem. We never allow this kind of insanity to prevail ever again.
Well, I think as we're seeing the collapse of the Western cabal, we're seeing the collapse of the Western media as well, because it's getting to stupid scales where people are just sick of it. People are sick of the lies. This week they were reporting that some of the cruise missiles that Russia shot into Syria landed in Iran, and the source was an unnamed US government source. And you just flick over to RT, and RT going, Jesus Christ, what are they reporting? This is a misused thing in media that's been used for years in Western media to say an unnamed source says this.
That basically means we just made this shit up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, people need to start to realise this. I think one of the important steps in understanding is to realise that the media is not reporting the truth or having an objective perspective of anything. It is reporting what it's told. It puts a slant on things. And you can see sometimes where very rapidly these stories are unravelling, because we're seeing even broadsheet newspapers now starting to challenge, not extensively, but we see odd articles coming out where they're challenging the perception of how we see things. And that's encouraging, but it's not significant enough. But people just need to address whatever they're being told and say, okay, does this actually really make sense? Or is this an objective viewpoint? How can we keep having unnamed sources? I mean, where's the credibility, as you say, in that kind of reporting? And I think that's a huge step forward to the realization that what we're told is essentially largely totally illusionary.
Well, it didn't make any sense anyway, saying that the cruise missiles landed in Iran, that Iran's an ally of Russia. If Iran had a problem, I'm sure they would have piped up about it.
Absolutely, and Iran and Russia would have been talking to each other going, I cannot believe they're trying to pull this one again. And the thing is, that's the important thing, is it's the fact that they always try the same, MO, as it were. They're always trying to convince people in the West that this has happened, or that happened, or this didn't happen. And it's the same MO time and time again. It's tired. It's out of date. If you spend 5 minutes to think about it, you go, hang on, that's all I keep hearing from. This doesn't make sense. They're not, whilst they have a lot of power, or did have a lot of power, and it's on the wane, they weren't actually very intelligent at thinking the logic of how they could influence people and make people believe things in ways that would have been far more convincing. So for that, we should be quite grateful they weren't that intelligent to do that.
Yeah, and you were totally right that at this point in time, it's probably the only point in time where I've actually seen articles coming out of all main newspapers actually challenging the narrative. And there's been articles out of The Guardian and various other papers saying Putin is right, get behind him on this. And I'm like, wow. But they've seen all the comments. If you just look at one of these anti-Russian propaganda pieces in one of our newspapers, just look at the comments underneath of it on Facebook or on Twitter, and it's just everybody saying the same thing. I'm sick of this. This is ridiculous. It's getting to stupid points. There was one comment I looked at the other day, which basically said what I've said on the show many times. The only sense seems to be coming out of RT, when you've got all these TV channels and all these newspapers just pushing out propaganda, and then you switch it over. It's like literally World War III on the mainstream media, and then you switch over to RT and they're going, right, these have reported this. This is what's actually going on. And anybody can use critical thinking. It's not, obviously there's propaganda from their side, but they're using logic, so you can go, hang on a minute. Yeah, they're right. That is a load of crap what they're reporting in the mainstream media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also increasingly their desperation to hang on to their credibility is for people to believe, and they're having to make even more absurd claims and absurd comments that people are now starting to go, hang on, this is ridiculous. I mean, I had a few people lately said to me who were very kind of, I don't buy any of this, Putin's the bad guy. And I've had people email me, and I've had odd people phone me and say, do you know what, actually we were watching the mainstream news, we get it now, this is just nonsense, we are being lied to. Because they are having to get more and more absurd to try and keep this illusion going, because, you know, as increasingly as we say, actions speak louder than words. When you see what Russia's doing in the Middle East, you go, well, it's pretty irrefutable that the West weren't actually doing anything. Or is it the reality that Russian intelligence and Russian military is far more capable of dealing with these problems than the West? And some people will go, well, that's the reality, but also people are going to go, hang on. If Russia had the intelligence to deal with the problem, they would have given that intelligence to the West if it was genuinely a war on terror. The fact Russia didn't give the intelligence is because they knew there's no point giving the intelligence to the enemy.
Well, exactly. I watched a CIA agent on RT, funny enough, an ex-CIA agent, and he said basically the West have no intelligence on the ground. They've got no idea where these guys are. They've got a little intelligence, but Russia's getting the intelligence from Syria, so they know exactly where they are. But what happens to the political landscape across the globe if Russia take out ISIS, stop the civil war in Syria, get permission from Iraq, stop the civil war in Iraq? What happens to the political landscape when that's seen across the globe?
Well, I think you will start to see increasingly more and more developments in the Middle East. I mean, we've seen how quickly they've responded to ISIS in a matter of a week or 72 hours initially. So yes, you'll see eventually, probably in a relatively short space of time, Syria, it will resolve the civil war aspect. Then there's a lot of rebuilding and that needs to happen in these nations. The same with Iraq. I think you'll see it happen in Afghanistan. And of course, what's interesting is the opium trade and the drugs trade that comes through Afghanistan, where the control is relinquished from the Western cabal who use the Taliban and they have their own military there to protect poppy fields. When that stops, the lack of the drugs trade is going to massively damage the cabal who are reliant on it to make massive profit to finance operations. So that will have devastating consequences. I think we're starting to see Saudi Arabia really creaking badly. I don't think the House of Saud, we've talked about this before, will last that much longer. The consequence of that will be that the Western sympathetic government, which was actually largely bullied into being that way, will cease to operate. So that will damage the cabal. And I think, interesting, without going too much into detail about Israel, we're seeing them have a very muted response to what's going on, very little said. I think it's for good reason. I don't expect to see Israel react aggressively to what Russia's doing. I know people do worry about and think that is a consequence that will come to pass. I don't think it will. And I think we will see this whole attempt of the West to control the Middle East, to destroy anybody who gets in their way, purely as a mechanism for, once again, asset stripping and seizing anything that was of any value, oil, gold, anything else that had any monetary value. They wanted to seize control of. That will stop. I think you will eventually see them deal with the problems in Libya, which has massive civil war caused by the completely bogus Arab Spring.
Do you see that being the next one after Iraq, going to Libya?
It may happen after, we may see Afghanistan then Libya, but I think we obviously see that Egypt now is a very pro-Russian government, not surprisingly because Russia's investing in that nation in terms of not just financial investment, but also politically they're involved in trying to support, because Egypt was once again another nation that was part of the so-called Arab Spring that failed. So we may see Egypt involved. I do suspect at some point Libya will be resolved. I probably do expect Libya is a horrendous situation, but there's probably a perception that in the grand scheme of things there's more important things to deal with. But in the fullness of time, I think we will see the whole of North Africa and the Middle East we will see the resolution and the removal of these problems, and that alone will be a defining moment when they kick out the insanity that's tried to prevail in that region for 100 years. Ever since the Balfour Declaration of, forgive my history, I think it was 1917, which to do with carving up the Middle East into regions and also the creation of nation-state of Israel was proposed at that time. We've seen problems ever since then. And we've had this realization this is nothing to do with the people of these nations. This is to do with a small, very small minority of insane individuals who want to control the world for their own ends. And ultimately, we're quite happy to destroy pretty much all of it if it meant it furthered their objectives. So we need to get away from labeling nations as problems and actually address who really is the problem. And it's not the people of these nations.
How would Russia get involved in Afghanistan? The government of Afghanistan is Western puppets, basically. So how would that play out?
Well, I think they're increasingly going, well, we can't allow this insanity to continue in our nation because our nation's being destroyed. We are just a mere puppet. And I think we're seeing that they've now publicly this week said we'd like Russia to get involved and remove the Taliban. So, yeah, it would be hugely devastating for the cabal, which is a good thing. But it's not that Russia's going to move in and divert all the opium trade to themselves and maximise massive profit. It's quite the contrary. It's to cut off, if the Western cabals like the sort of mythological seven-headed hydra, it's another way of chopping another one of those heads off. But it's a significant one because the drugs trade is hugely finances cabal activities and has done for a very, very long time. And not just out of Afghanistan, there's other routes. I mean, something we can touch on regarding Germany, which German people realise one of their military bases is used for drugs trafficking to the west.
Mm-hmm.
They'd be furious. But that's a reality. That's not an illusion. That's the truth. And then eventually at some point that will come out.
Okay, but while we're on the subject of the changing political landscape, and you just touched on Germany there, Patrick did ask a little while ago in PIR chat, and I know it's a thorny issue, you never like giving timescales, but he's asking, do you see a timescale for the breakup of the EU?
That's a really good question.
Well done, Patrick.
Truthfully, I couldn't tell you. I mean, I think the issue is at some point there will be, we've spoke about this, I mean, I've said something could happen before the year end. I couldn't tell you when. Realistically, there'll be major events that will happen no later than 2016 at some point then. And that will be a catalyst for a whole bunch of events, which would include the collapse of the European Union. So, sometime no later than 2016. Can something happen sooner? It's a possibility. But this is such a fluid situation. I mean, if you'd said a month ago Russia was going to step into Syria within the next 2 weeks, I'd have said, I don't know, maybe it could happen in 6 months' time or 3 months. We're now seeing a lot of events happening that we envisage would happen, but not necessarily happening as fast as they are. Now, the Middle East is a particularly important political hotbed for the cabal, hence why the involvement, I think, now is significant and crucial. It's to try and stabilise the region. I don't doubt Putin and Russia did what they did now for very good reason. What those specific reasons are is not entirely clear, but there's no doubt the timing is hugely significant. So, well, the European Union will collapse at some point for sure. It could, if major catalytic events happen. It's possible it could happen before the year end. I wouldn't rule that out. But I would say, as things currently stand, something will certainly happen some point in 2016. That, I think, is an inevitability. Will that change? It's possible. I'm not dodging the point. If something didn't happen in 2016, I'll say, okay, my idea that something would happen in 2016 was wrong. But I just don't see that the present system and the way things are will survive beyond the end of 2016. Certainly, I think it's more likely to be sooner in 2016, where these events do happen, where it becomes irrefutable that the entire sort of apparatus of the Western financial system will go down, as well as whatever the political, social, and economic consequences are.
Does it not collapse pretty much immediately once one nation state leaves the Union?
Oh, if a nation left, it would do. It could just be, for example, though, that it doesn't even need that. There could be a major Western bank collapses. See, because after 2008, they inexplicably kind of effectively lassoed all the Western banks together. And they're involved in some impossibly convoluted and complex financial arrangements. But it basically means if one bank goes down, then all the rest will collapse as well. This is why they've had secret bailouts for trillions of dollars to prop them all up, because there was a realization if one goes, they'll all go. So that could be the cause of it. You know, we could have a situation where China resets the gold price. We'll talk about China in detail shortly, where they say we're going to reset the gold price, which we know they will do at some point. That will cause a derivatives implosion, which could collapse the Western Bank, which could collapse the Western, the European Union, for example. So it doesn't have to come from the consequence of a nation saying we're going to leave the European Union. And I think this was partly feeds into what went on in Greece. The obvious situation was, right, let's just leave the European Union, and discussions were had with Putin, and by all accounts Putin said, don't leave the European Union. Now that seems counterintuitive, and people say, well, surely that's a good thing. Well, it's always the thing, yes, we want the end of the cabal and we want the world to change, but be careful what you wish for, because there are unintended consequences of just saying, let's just do something. And the timing and effort is crucial, and whatever Russia and China do, they do it because the timing is important. There's a reason for it. They don't just go, well, actually, let's just go in and destroy this situation with ISIS. They could have done it 2 years ago, or when it was Al-Qaeda, and they could have done it when ISIS came into the public spotlight, as it was called, and they started marching through Syria and other nations, and in Iraq, and with devastating consequences. But Russia sat back and went, no, now's not the time to do it. So we always have to factor that into our thinking, which is why when China and Russia make announcements of doing things, they're doing it for a good reason, and it's all part of building up this head of steam towards achieving the objective, which is this reset, whatever the reset may mean, and it could mean 100 things to 100 different people. But that will then have hugely devastating consequences for the cabal, but also correspondingly hugely significant consequences for everybody in all the nations of the world. And you're absolutely right, that could be the moment where the idea of the European Union just collapses and implodes because this huge reset's happened.
Yeah, it would instantly collapse. That's my thoughts. It's been my thoughts for some years. As soon as one member nation leaves the EU, that's the end.
Oh yeah, in that situation, yeah.
Yeah,
sure,
because they're talking about having more member states, and if one leaves, then you're not going to get people coming in.
No, and of course you have to bear in mind that nations are being railroaded and forced into joining. But I think increasingly the sheer notion that, given the financial calamity that befalls us, the nations are going to, even though they're under extreme duress to join, that is not going to happen. And other events will overtake that word. That will be kind of rendered superfluous anyway.
Mark's just added a tagline to that question of Patrick's, and he's asking, are there any signs to look out for that will show us that the beginning of the end is happening?
Yeah, because people obviously want to prepare.
Well, truthfully, without sounding too flippant, the beginning of the end started when Lehman's went down in 2008. It's been a very, very slow process over a long period of time. I mean, someone asked me a question to mention about BRICS and how they came out. I mean, the BRIC, as it was less South Africa, came as a consequence of Lehman's. It was formed in 2009, really in mid-June in Russia. South Africa joined in 2010. This was a direct reaction to Lehman's and a realization that these nations went, we have to form political union, economic, social, and look after our own interests. There are consequences. You've seen a lot of consequences of these actions. So what can we actually expect to see? I don't think you're going to see anything that will give us an indication that oh, it's going to happen tomorrow or next week. I think the issue is be prepared every day from now on, because at some point it will happen. I mean, don't live in fear. Don't get driven into a position where you get panic-stricken and it, basically consumes your every thought, every living day of your life, because, we could be sat here in 2 months having discussions and there's a lot more progress, but that event hasn't happened. But be as prepared as you can, and don't expect to be given some great warning of things happening, but there is sufficient warnings out there now. I mean, maybe if we start to talk a bit about China, this will highlight some of the issues that are happening now, which will, while it's not directly obvious that this impacts us in the West and what's going on, it's a clear consequence that there are major developments happening in the East where the financial system is going to be reset. And these are things that we need to pay attention to. And I've obviously recently started a Facebook page not that long ago, which is called the Sirius Report. That's SIRIUS. Now, we try to put things on there that is all geared to giving people an indirect understanding of, well, these are things that are happening. Pay attention to these. Read the articles if you want to join the page. If you've got questions, post them. I will answer them as best I can. And to try and, if there's things people want clarifying, I do appreciate that someone could read an article and go, do you know what, I don't even understand what this means. Well, okay, if you don't understand
I cut you off there. We're just going to break. We'll be back.
Okay.
This is Enemy Within on CityRadio.com.
Joe Joseph here for Truth Frequency Radio. According to allgov.com, since 9/11, a total of 238 Americans have died from a terrorist attack. That's 24 a year, making your chance of dying 1 in 625,000. Conversely, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of becoming a victim of police brutality. Yet we spend trillions of dollars on the war on terror while militarizing an abusive police force. At TruthFrequencyRadio.com, we have a team of the very best personalities in independent media. A team that's dedicated to bringing you reliable and rock-solid news and information so you can arm yourself with knowledge and join the fight against worldwide oppression and tyranny. Truth Frequency Radio. News without the hate, hype, and fear.
And now it's time for comments from our listeners.
Mike writes,
So, what do you do? I have listened to the show enough to believe the majority of what is stated, but still, what movements do you support? What actions have you set in motion aside from the enlightening of the masses? I never seem to find any action to put these words into effect. So what say you? A program meant to incite the masses to rise against their tyrannical masters? Or just a venue for you guys to scratch a living off of?
Dear Mike, it looks like you've busted us. Our day jobs are really just a front, just to cover up the fact that we make so much money off of doing what we do, that every single one of the hosts on the station has a full-time job just to cover up the fact that they're making so much money doing this. It always has been, and always will be, all about the Benjamins.
We are submersed in a construct that was designed to break us and keep us broken, but it hasn't. It failed. We still go on because we were designed from an eternal template of infinite creativity and not a synthetic house of cards built on pride and false power. Breaking free from the programs and paradigms that hold us down takes courage, endurance, tenacity, and trust. The reason it is so hard is because to be a free and sovereign being, we have to smash every lie, even if it hurts. It is good to be reminded of how resilient, unbreakable, magnificent, and powerful we truly are. And if anything provides a foundation for that, it is the book Our Universal Journey. Go to ouruniversaljourney.com.au.
You are now tuned into the Truth Frequency.
We are TFR. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Welcome back to the second half of Enemy Within on truthfrequencyradio.com on the 10th of October 2015. With our guest today, Paul. Just for the break, you talked about your group on Facebook, Paul, the Sirius Report. And you put the feelers out this week to get some questions for the show today. Do you want to address some of those? You were talking about one in particular just before the break, actually, about the advent of BRICS.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how this political union came about, how it's grown and developed, and how we now have the BRICS Development Bank. And someone asked me, you know, how do we know this isn't going to be controlled? They say Rothschild bankers. Okay, we'll use that phrase. The point is, we're back to this issue of, if you look at everything that Russia and China are trying to do, it is everything to destroy. I mean, I don't solely call it Rothschild bankers, but destroy the Western cabal. It's self-evident in all their actions and how those nations, and particularly Russia, have been attacked through Ukraine was an attempt to economically destabilize Russia, to overthrow Putin. They've paid for political parties in Russia to try and destabilize the Russian government and remove Putin. Of course, that's failed because Putin's popularity is at 80-odd% and at an all-time high. There's clear evidence. And why would Russia trust Rothschild bankers when they were behind the people who to overthrow the Tsars and create the Russian Revolution in 1917? And the history goes on. The communism was a Western initiative. It was used to control Russia. Stalin was a Western-controlled, backed politician and mass murderer and everything else that he did during the war and before the war and after the war. It wasn't really until the early 2000s when Putin took control that the Western influence was removed. They started to remove the oligarchs and to clean up because they realized the country was infiltrated by people who had no vested interest in what was beneficial to Russia as a nation. And whether people like Putin or not, he's very pro-Russia. He very much puts his nation first, which you would expect any politician to do for their country. But he's also not to the detriment of every other nation in that process. So the notion, and if the recent activities of Russia in the Middle East is anything to go by, people must now begin to realise Putin isn't a cabal agent, never was and never will be. So I think that answers that. But I think if we kind of move on to China, that will help, I think, for people to understand. When people say, well, what events can I expect to see that will indicate to me that there are changes afoot and things are happening very rapidly? Well, actually, I'll start with one of the questions. I had someone asking me that Jim Willey said recently that the reset had been put back 12 months because China's renminbi had not reached sufficient usage yet. Well, I have a lot of time for Jim. He's a great guy. He's very intuitive, has great understanding, great analysis. I don't agree that it will be put back 12 months. I think renminbi usage is growing. We've seen, I think, the last week where it's now the fourth most used currency. It's usurped the yen, so it's only now behind the dollar, which is obviously decreasing, the pound and the euro. I don't think it's a necessary criteria for the reset to happen. How much renminbi usage is going on at any particular time in the world. I think the renminbi usage is increasing massively, very rapidly, and that kind of neatly dovetails into the first point that we've seen this week, that China's announced the China International Payment System, which is known as SIPS. That came online on Thursday. Clearly an alternative to SWIFT payment. Now, what that will do is it will allow kind of cross-border settlement in yuan or renminbi, same thing, and encourage the use of renminbi/yuan globally. That will help the support of the real economy in China, but also will help Chinese companies have access to the global markets. Now, if you'd have said 12 months ago, China will have a working alternative to SWIFT, people would have gone, that's impossible, it will take decades, it will take years, it might take 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Well, it's now operational. We know Russia are not that far also having an alternative to SWIFT. This is a step that people need to be aware of and say that is significant. That is a huge development because it's a way of usurping the Western financial system, which allows these nations like China to trade with other nations and get around the issue of how sanctions can be imposed because they can stop payments, they can assess what is going on in terms of transactions between nations. It will mutually benefit China and other nations using this financial system. So there's one indication that they moved very, very quickly, incredibly quickly, to bring this system into place, which is now operational. That will grow and expand, of course. As that grows and expands and you have cross-border settlement between, let's just say for argument's sake, the renminbi and the ruble, or the renminbi and probably even the yen and things like that, that seems inexplicable at the moment. You will start to see that, and maybe some of the more emerging countries. That will start to decrease the usage of the dollar. And this whole Western financial system is all about US hegemony, which was, we have the global currency, we control everything. But once they no longer have the control over the global currency, and that's weakening daily, weekly, monthly, that will be hugely damaging. So that's a big significant development. We also see everything is about, if you've got the reserve currency, it's confidence in the dollar. Well, we're seeing increasingly nations dumping, not just China, but we've seen Taiwan recently, but also Norway. Now, Norway's very interesting because, being from the UK, people always focus on the Thatcher era and say, these were the biggest mistakes. The biggest mistake that the Thatcher era is, unlike Norway, which had huge North Sea oil assets, it created an enormous sovereign wealth fund, which is about $850 billion. Now, the legacy of Thatcher was not to create this sovereign wealth fund from our oil reserve, but instead give ludicrous tax breaks at the expense of the sovereign wealth fund. As people in history realise, that is the most criminal thing that the Thatcher era did, because if they created a sovereign wealth fund, it could have been used to finance projects, finance industry, move industries that weren't financially productive, that is true, but create new industry, stimulate growth in the economy, and we could have had a far stronger nation. So, for me, that was the most criminal thing the Thatcher era did, amongst a lot of things that people are still aggrieved about that went on at that time. But the significance is that Norway's dumping them because, from what I understand, a proportion of that sovereign wealth fund is tied up in US bonds. It sounds kind of unbelievable that would be the case, but that is why they're dumping significant amount. And we're seeing nation after nation dumping. Not Russia's been dumping them. China is dumping them huge in enormous quantities on a monthly basis. There's another indication to you. Things are not working out the way the West, what the cabal wants them to be, and that is another huge financial indication of major problems. Because the US has got to somehow absorb all these dollars that are being dumped. Now they can fudge things and try to find all manner of reasons and ways as to how it's possible to circumvent this problem. But the confidence in the dollar's waning, and it's waning rapidly on a literally weekly basis. So there's a kind of another indication of major issues. We now know there's about 1,700 banks in more than 100 countries using renminbi for payments. So there's another indication that the renminbi is gathering pace as a prospective reserve currency. The IMF has admitted recently it's, essentially 99% certain, which means it's going to happen, where China will become a reserve currency. I don't kind of hold much sway in this special drawing rights. So we're basically, the currencies in it are zombie currencies. I mean, how could you ever want to join a basket of currencies that includes particularly the yen and obviously the dollar?
Yeah, I'll stop you there because we've got a couple of questions in the PIR chat room. Andy, do you want to address the questions?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted there. Questions. We got the question from Tony, which was, how does China get to reset the gold prices? Rothschild set the gold prices and have been selling it to cheap to China, India and Russia for 3 years. Wonder why? And the other question is from Kerry, and she's heard you mention profound benefits for humanity, and she's asking, can you elaborate? What are those profound benefits for humanity?
Okay, let's deal with the gold price. The issue with the whole point of gold is, if you think about the kind of logic of this, China and Russia could sink the West tomorrow. They could sink it in half an hour. That's the shift, because China, particularly with all the US debt it owns, its influence in the world, what it now controls owns a lot of US assets, is in a position to be very strong. And in 2008, Russia wanted to sink the West, and China went, whoa, hang on a minute. Yeah, we can do this, but it's not mutually beneficial to us to do it because we don't have the infrastructure in place. So we don't have, for example, a development bank. We don't have an alternative to SWIFT, etc., etc. So, but the issue is the West owned China an awful lot of gold, and China wants the gold back. So part of the reason for the settlement of gold is that the West is in no position of strength to say to China, you can't have your gold. So China's been getting the gold back, and the whole point of why the price has been suppressed is because the West is not in a position to allow the gold and particularly the silver price to go, in silver's case, above $50, $60. If it does, the derivatives position that banks hold would collapse one of the banks, ergo collapse the Western financial system. This hasn't been a matter of choice that the West has been having to sell huge amounts of gold to China and the nations very cheaply. They're in no financial position to stop it. So the point about, this gold, what allows China to do that? Well, at the point when China drains the West of gold, which it pretty much has now, I mean, this is why I said, I was checking out this week, I want to buy a small amount of physical metal. I'm being charged, or notionally charged if I want to buy it, 40%, 35% premium to the underlying price. It's the same with gold. It's now starting to hit the small retail bullion dealers, where they're having to charge massive premiums because they can't get hold of it. So, yes, the point is, when the West is drained of gold, he who owns the gold controls everything, because they can then say, well, do you know what? We're going to launch our own gold price fix, which, of course, the Shanghai Gold Corporation is going to do. It's imminent. It could happen next week, or it's supposed to be late September, so I would say any time from now it will announce it. The delay, it might be because if they do announce it, they'll say, well, we're resetting the gold price to reflect fair value, because we know the value of gold is not fair value for the price. If they say, which they're supposed to say, we're going to reset it to $2,000, $2,500 an ounce, the West has no answer. It has no physical metal. And, how can you arbitrage against that trade? If you don't have the metal, you can't do anything to circumvent it. You can't say, well, we're going to stick to our gold price of, what is it, 1,150 currently. They don't have the gold to do that. And China will say, okay, arbitrage. But of course, anyone, like say I own an ounce of gold, I think, I'll go and sell it to the Chinese for $2,500. China's going to go, fine, sell it to us. But you're not going to be able to buy it back for 1,150. Because it's impossible. It's not going to be feasible to do that. So the situation is, of course, the derivatives market will implode because of the positions that are held in Western banks, which are obviously designed to try and suppress the price, which is why we see this farcical disconnect between the physical metal, which is being purchased globally, and not just in the East, but Germany, there's huge retail interest. The UK, we're seeing, even in the US, Silver Eagles, they keep running out of it repeatedly. So there is a huge amount of interest at retail level as well to acquire gold and silver. So most definitely, China is fully in position to reset the gold price when it wants to, with kind of devastating consequences for the West when they do, because of derivative exposure principally. And also because this is why China's been buying all the metal up for a long period of time, and why it patiently says, we just keep buying it. They have people, agents, scouring the world for a ton of gold. If it's possible, can you get me a ton of gold? They will pay a premium. They're quite happy to pay a significant premium for it because they know the gold price will get reset. So in that sense, yeah, it's an inevitability. And don't imagine, if you think the Western cabal is so strong, why is it every single one of their principal objectives has failed in the last few years? And that's in its entirety. They failed completely because they don't have the power. They give people the impression they still have the power, but that's just a fear-based illusion. They don't. The difference is China, unlike the Western cabal and Russia, don't press buttons and make things happen with a knee-jerk reaction. They do it in a measured, calm, considered approach, and they have been making plans and putting plans into place for a long period of time. They don't make knee-jerk reactions to anything. They won't deviate from their plans. Their plans is, we will bring things online. So we have, as I said just earlier, this new alternative to SWIFT, which is this SIP, which is obviously China International Payment System. So, on to the question about the idea of a new paradigm and where it changes. The thing is, if you remove this overarching cabal influence, which is all being designed to suppress countries, suppress the people, lie to them, destroy nations who oppose them, and even destroy the nations who don't oppose them, such as Tom highlighted with the European Union. When you remove that, yes, there's a long period of instability, which I wouldn't begin to guess how long that will be for Western nations. But when we get out the other side, we can have a world where nations won't be at war with each other because there won't be any. People say this isn't going to happen. Well, it is going to happen because nations in the world are sick to death of what has been going on for hundreds of years. Certainly, that's self-evident in history, and more so probably in the last 100 years or so since the advent of the Federal Reserve. People are aware of it and they've had enough of it. So we can rebuild a world where nations will work together. People won't be indoctrinated on a divide and conquer basis. We can learn the real history. We can have education as it should be, which is with enlightenment rather than process-driven nonsense, which is about making people get meaningless pieces of paper that makes them feel very good about themselves but doesn't equip them to live in a world of reality, equips them to live in a world of illusion. That's not a criticism of any individual. That's what's being done to it. We can have a health service which is run for the interests of the people rather than the interests of pharmaceutical companies who only make money by people being ill. If everyone was healthy, pharmaceutical companies would go bust. And that's something people need to go, well, okay, what does he mean by that? What it means is, of some of the health treatments people have for our benefit or for the benefit of pharmaceutical companies, I would suggest very much so it's for the benefit of pharmaceutical companies. So the list goes on. We can have a political system where we have a government that's run for the interests of the people. We have a financial system that doesn't destroy people economically and financially. It's run for the betterment of the people of nations. So people who have great business ideas can grow businesses. People who have skills and abilities and talents can succeed. So you don't have to be part of some elite club or know someone who is to be able to get on in the world and be the person that you're capable of being. These are not aspirations. These are realistic goals that will happen in the future.
Another question on what you've been talking about, a comment in the chat room saying most gold is paper gold. Does that not mean that gold is now fiat? I mean, the paper gold.
No. Well,
gold, but China's buying up physical gold.
Yeah, there is a paper market. It's run by the Western cabal. The real physical market which exists, and you and I can participate if we buy an ounce of silver or an ounce of gold.
I've done it myself.
Very much
I've bought silver myself, yeah.
Yeah, and no, the physical market is where this whole financial paradigm will be based on. China will have gold-backed currencies. Russia will. We will have gold trade settlement where nations will trade, and then at the end of the year go, you owe me this, that's equivalent to 10 tons of gold. Okay, we ship you 10 tons of gold. That's the market. Don't get confused with the insane paper market, which is meaningless, which is fiat-based, which is utter nonsense. There is a real physical gold market out there that the West tries to convince everyone don't own gold, don't own silver. Well, we're seeing nations and people realizing that's actually a nonsense. But yeah, there is a paper fiat. It's called ETFs or whatever else you want to call it. These do not serve the purpose of what is going to happen in the future, which is going to be physically owned, held metal, gold or silver. That's the future, not the paper market, which is the farce we have to endure now, which suppresses the price for the benefit of a small minority of people.
Rob said the perceived value of gold is mental control. You can't eat gold.
No, you can't eat gold, but that's not the purpose of it.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of it is if you look through history, the price of gold has always been consistent. If you pretty much bought a loaf of bread in Roman times, it would cost you the same in gold terms what it costs you now. It's a situation is that gold whether people think gold has a monetary value or not, it does. And it will be used as a benchmark to say, rather than trading in fiat currency, which we know is insanity, and has caused rampant inflation, which is why the dollar, since the inception of the Federal Reserve, is worth probably less than 2% now of what it was then. Gold holds value. It is a store of wealth. It is real money. Paper money is not money. So if we have a financial system where nations who have gold will have stronger currencies, it will also enable gold trade between nations. Those nations, such as the US, who don't have gold, and this is something we can come on when we discuss Germany later on. The issue of those nations who don't have the gold, they're not going to be able to have a currency backed by gold, so therefore their currency is going to be devalued. But devaluation of currency will have serious consequences for their import capability of nations. So those nations dependent on import will become hyperinflationary. So yes, you can't eat gold, but that's not the point. I'll use a simple analogy. Imagine, and it isn't correct obviously, but imagine if today I could buy a loaf of bread for an ounce of gold, and that ounce of gold's worth $1,150, just to keep the math simple. I know it doesn't actually mean anything. When we get the gold price reset and gold goes to what it is, the difference is, when you want to go to buy your loaf of bread, you're going to probably pay $3,000-4,000 for your loaf of bread. But correspondingly, this is where the difference is going to be. You won't need to go and give an ounce of gold. You'll be able to give a quarter of an ounce of gold to buy the same loaf of bread. That's where the store of value is. So when fiat currencies blow up and you're paying inflationary rates to buy basic goods, then you're going to say, well, I don't want to be part of this fiat currency system. Whereas if you have gold, it will give you greater purchasing power. That's why owning physical metal is hugely important. And I've kind of underplayed the significance. I will see gold price going 10, 15-fold higher. Silver, easily 40-fold higher. That's where the store of wealth is going to be, because not only will you see the corresponding price massively increase in relative terms for those assets and why ownership is going to be important, it's also a store of wealth. So if we do get hyperinflation, which is a distinct possibility, then at least your gold will still be worth the same. So you can go and buy a loaf of bread with whatever proportionate amount of gold. That is not an ounce, as I've suggested, but that was just to illustrate the point. But you'll also then be able to correspondingly still buy that, whereas your money would be worthless in relative terms. So that's why, no, you can't eat the gold, but the gold will allow you to eat. The paper currency, which you can't eat either, ironically, will buy you nothing.
And you'll be using it to wallpaper your house.
Yeah, or as people did in the Weimar Republic days, they couldn't get their food. They used to just take it home and burn it to keep warm in the evenings, because it was worth more to them as a fuel than it was as currency. And that seems extreme, and I'm not sure we'll see Weimar Republic days again. But who knows possibly what the repercussions will be. So, yeah, the argument of can't eat gold is, for me, well, it's physically obviously impossible, but that doesn't really deal with the issue of what the reality of physical metal ownership is. And when the reset happens, people who own physical metal will be very pleased they did.
Paul, when we mention gold, we often get this issue raised, and I'd just like to get your take on it. Mark asked there in the chat room, what about monatomic gold, which can be consumed and apparently is life extending?
We'll take that up after the break. Unfortunately, we'll have to cut you off there. We're just going to break. If you want to throw your questions in the chat room, we'll be back in a couple of minutes. This is Enemy Within on truthfrequencyradio.com.
Truth Frequency Radio is your number one source for news and information without the hate, hype, and fear. We are proud to bring you cutting-edge programs like The Kev Baker Show, The Christopher Everard Show, The Freedom Link with Joe Joseph, Truth Frequency with Chris and Sherry Geo, Strange World with Mark Sargent, X Squared with Brooks Agnew, Down the Rabbit Hole with Popeye, Freaky Friday with The Woo Crew, Waking Up the Masses with Robert Bruce, Phoenix Rising Radio, and dozens more. Did you know you can listen from any computer, mobile device, or from any telephone by dialing 832-225-5308 or call into your favorite show toll free at 866-37-TRUTH. Uncensored talk and news you won't hear in the mainstream media 24 hours a day. Truth Frequency Radio. Wherever you are, make it TFR. The Truth Frequency.
Greetings, Earth Explorers. My name is Brooks Agnew, and I am your host on X Squared Radio every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Frequency Radio Network. This is where the past meets the future. We explore the mysteries of the universe and of the Earth. We might go a little past your imagination, but have no fear. You will be safely traveling with us. We will dissolve the propaganda of dangerous people with dangerous plans for the planet. We will discuss the latest technologies and challenges for humankind. We will discover the safest place for you to stand when the thinkings and doings of mankind come flying apart, and how you can be one of the people that helps put it back together. Join us.
Visualize an infinite hologram of unconditional love above your head. This is a holographic sphere with the flower of life pattern infinitely expanding inwardly to infinity.
The all-new Sacred Geometry Shop has arrived, featuring 8 of the world's most renowned sacred geometry and visionary artists. The mission of SGS is to embed sacred geometry art, frequencies, and equations into all conventional products in order to raise the vibration and help heal one's own individual life. Products include art, canvas prints, skateboards, Galaxy and iPhone cases, clothing, hats, jewelry, home decor, yoga mats, and a new sacred geometry skincare line. Enter the word STARSEED for an additional 25% discount. Log on today to sacredgeometryshop.com and feel the vibration.
Truth Frequency with Chris and Shuri Geo. Friday and Saturday on Truth Frequency Radio.
Welcome back to the last part of Enemy Within with our guest today, Paul. Just before the break, you were addressing a question in the chat room, Andy. Do you want to repeat that for people who have just joined us?
Got muted for a second again. Mark mentioned about monatomic gold and its consumption, which is supposedly extends your life, makes you live longer. Any thoughts on that, Paul?
I've heard of it, but I can't really comment on it. I don't know. I mean, I've heard it mentioned in the past, and I've read bits about it, but I don't really know to whether that's the case or not. And but it's an interesting concept, that's for sure.
I wanted to ask you, Paul, about the. I asked you this probably on the first show that we had, maybe the second, about the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Then I asked you about them, and you said I wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. But where do you see them going? Do you see them actually dying out in the future?
Yeah, I don't think they'll have any. I don't see them having any future. I mean, you may see them, of course, morph into something else, which may work in the future. But as things currently stand now, I don't see cryptocurrencies having any future. And I'm starting to see the usual cabal, serial offenders starting to talk it up, and I think, well, that's enough for me as well. I wouldn't deal with them. There's no liquidity in them. I don't see any kind of future as they currently stand, but who knows, in the future there may be used as part of a bartering system in some way for trade, because bartering may actually evolve in ways that we can't currently comprehend. But as things stand now, I wouldn't. That's only my personal view. I wouldn't deal with them at all.
Yeah, it was a great point about bartering, because something just anything has the value that you put on it, that someone else puts on it. So if you've got some vegetables or some fruit to trade for a piece of gold or a piece of Bitcoin, and you put a value on that, it's whatever you put that value at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And at some point that could become very relevant, where people own assets that which will be worth a huge amount of money to other people. But yeah, bartering, I think, it will become something which will have far more relevance in the future. But specifically how that will work at the moment is, well, in itself, bartering is between two parties. So I guess that really is a transaction between them as to how they want that to be carried out. But I do see it will grow and expand as part of a kind of new financial system and a new way of thinking. And I think the reset is as much about, there are financing, but I think the reset is as much a reset in how humanity perceives the world and how it should be run. It's not just about financial reset, and I think it's going to be important that everyone, doesn't matter what nation we're in, everyone's going to have to reassess the world they have lived in and the illusionary nature of that, and say, okay, going forward, what is best for us to live? And small matter, we used to have really strong communities, which exist in the UK, and they've been largely destroyed, and that was by design. I think we'll see the regrowth of that, I think we'll see a difference in people's perception of what really matters and what doesn't matter. And sometimes you have to take people to the very edge of literally their sanity before they'll realise enough's enough and we have to change. And hopefully we don't have to go to such extreme measures. But it will be a point where people will reevaluate and reassess what matters. And this is something as to why, just in very simple terms, China and Russia encourage their people to buy physical metal, because they're saying this is a store of wealth. It's important you own this. That we never hear anybody when did we ever hear anyone in Western governments telling their people to buy physical metal? In fact, they keep telling us all to sell our gold.
Mm-hmm.
Via these companies, they will give you a great price for your gold. Well, do you really think they're buying all this gold to sell it at a loss? No. Why are they acquiring it? And that's what people need to ask themselves, whereas we actively see nations in other parts of the world encouraging their people to take physical ownership for very good reason.
Well, I think that links into what I was going to say. It is an intellectual reset along with a financial reset. But I think people are waking up now, and people are going to wake up dramatically. That's why I asked you earlier, what do you think will happen if Russia actually sort out the problem in Syria, sort out the problem in Iraq, where these have been predominantly places that the world policeman, the US gets involved in and then just messes them up, basically. But they're seen as the world's policemen. They're the ones who sort things out, or the NATO is the ones who sort things out. But if Russia do that, then it's a total reset of the mind across the spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, yeah, that's absolutely the case. And it kind of also feeds into, why the re-education process is much also an understanding of, well, what does it mean that China is probably arguably the largest global economy now? Well, that has huge significance because it's grown while most people don't realise, and therefore it does have far greater standing in the world. People said to me, because we said on the last show, well, Shanghai's going to start trading oil in renminbi. Well, so what? Well, they're the largest importer of oil. Oil's always been denominated in dollars. That's going. That's another huge, significant reason why this reset's coming about. We have this big notion of, well, China's having all these capital outflows. Oh, it's a lack of confidence in China. No, it's Chinese firms or businesses being financed by Chinese banks to invest in overseas companies. And we saw, I'm not going to list, there was a whole list I gave in the previous show we did, of where Chinese consortiums and Chinese businesses are investing abroad. China involved in Africa is well known. They currently have over 3,000 active projects. They've built enormous amounts of infrastructure, roads and projects to stimulate growth in those regions. And these lists go on. These are all important steps as to why people need to realise that there is a huge paradigm shift. It's been going on for a long time, just the media doesn't tell you. So don't look for the media to tell you. Go and look at alternative ways to find information. I mean, as without too much information overload the Facebook page, we try to highlight things that people will find of interest to tell them this is what's going on. But if you don't understand, ask questions. I'll come back and provide answers as best as possible, as quick as possible. And it's part of, I understand people don't understand what's going on. That's perfectly okay. It's not everyone's world. Some people don't have the time. Some people just don't have the inclination. And some people, they do find it very, very confusing, and I do appreciate it. It's a very confusing minefield of information to understand. But if we can help people to get a better understanding of what's going on, then all the better. It's also kind of, once again, feeds into other aspects of what's going on with China in terms of, they keep being told China overstates its economic position. Well, the Economic Centre for Strategic Studies, which is a Western recognised think tank that produces great information, said, well, actually, yeah, they have, but they've understated their GDP by 15%. This is why China very much underplays its true physical gold holdings. Is 30,000 tons, I believe. Russia's probably about the same. These nations don't advertise the fact of what they're doing. They just quietly go about their business. But we've now got to the point through alternative media and hopefully to a small extent Facebook pages such as what I've had set up, is we're giving people information, but if there's things you don't see and you want to know, join and ask questions and say, can you comment on this? What do you think about this? And we'll do our best to address it, because this is about an education process for people to understand what's going on in the world, rather than the old days where knowledge was power. I'm sorry, knowledge isn't power. It has to be shared, and people need to understand. And that way, because ultimately if we want to change the world, it is about a re-education and understanding for everyone to appreciate what is going on and why it needs to change and what we can do to change it.
Well, it's like I've said many times on this show, we now have the other side of the story. We have RT telling the Russian side of the story. Yes, it's the Russian propaganda channel, but when it's so ludicrous what Western media is putting out, it's so easy for RT to rip it apart. And you can watch that and you can say, hang on a minute, yeah, they're ripping this apart. If you've got critical thinking, you look at it and you go, yeah, it's true what they're saying, or, yeah, that's not true. Or you weigh both sides of the argument and you go, somewhere in the middle. But we have both sides of the argument. When somebody's talking about China, look at Chinese news, see what they're saying, and then weigh it up and go, right, I'll come to the conclusion this is probably the truth.
Yeah, and also it's a lot of the time, and this is where the difficulty is, if you don't operate inside the financial system, then it is difficult to understand why things happen. And a point I think worth making, because I'm kind of mindful of time, to do with Germany, is this week, after years of being bullied into it, the Bundesbank finally compiled a definitive list of all the German-owned gold bars and where they're stored. And we posted a link on my Facebook page. This is a 2,300-page document. The intention was to get people to read every page, but it was to give authenticity to the comment rather than just saying this list being compiled. Now, of course, people say, well, so what? Who cares? What's the significance of that? Well, the significance isn't just the Germans having to compile the list. There's also a sizable amount of that list is supposed to be stored in the US. Now, I'm on a record, I'm happy to say, I don't think the US owns any physical gold, or if they do, it's minuscule. Now, at some point in this audit process, someone's going to turn to the US and go, okay, where's the gold? And of course they will, at some point they're going to be proved and outed to not have this gold, as they claim.
In Fort Knox.
In Fort Knox. That's going to be hugely damaging. So things are happening not just to say to Germany, get your house in order and compile a list of your audited gold. It's also to start to highlight the lies that we're being told elsewhere. And it's something I spoke to Andy as well before we went on air earlier on. It's like this whole thing. China and Russia are very cleverly stretching the Western cabal globally to damage them. So there's all this disputed waters in the South China Seas, and China's going, bring your forces here, bring your military here. It's all part of an exercise of stretching the cabal to breaking point. And the cabal is stupidly falling for it, which is good and is an encouraging development. But there are reasons for things. We come back to this point, Russia, China do what they do for reasons. They don't just take action unilaterally with no consequence or thought of intention of what the purpose of that action is. And that's the other important thing, is for everyone to ask themselves, why are these nations doing what they're doing at this particular time?
Yeah, that links into the question that we've just got in the chat room. Why does the USA and Europe sell debt and vital infrastructure to the Chinese? I wouldn't sell them to my enemy and give them such weapons.
Well, the point is they have no option, because when China owns the debt, and then China says, well, I'm going to dump my treasury bonds to buy assets, the US has to maintain confidence, notional confidence in the reserve currency. We'll go, well, we've got to hide this fact as best we can, so we'll have to consume all them dumping all these dollars. And then China can go and buy whatever it likes, wherever it likes. And the cabal can do anything, which is why, for example, China's been buying up all the ports in the US. The thing is, at the end of the day, without this investment, it would seriously also damage the US. So the US cabal stuck between a rock and a hard place, because whilst they wanted to try and preserve the illusion that all was fine, they're equally mindful that, well, if China hadn't acquired these assets and done what it's done, all our ports would have gone bust. People would have gone, hang on, why is this happening? They've acquired Detroit, Michigan. They've bought up industrial parks to redevelop the US. This isn't done because the cabal want them to do it, or there's some great big agreement between these nations to pull a fast one and do a 180, and actually China's cabal. No, they don't have any choice. The cabal are hanging on by a thread. They will do anything to try and preserve their notional power, which of course they don't have any. And even the Trump card of trying to start major military conflict and serious wars has failed. They have no answer to anything anymore. So if your enemy supposedly says to you, well, we'll allow you to keep going by acquiring assets and dumping our dollars, and we'll allow you to try and hide the fact. But, frankly, we don't care because we're making progress towards our goal. The fact you want to keep hanging on to power grimly is to your own detriment. We'll just carry on doing what we're doing, knowing that full well we can achieve our objectives with your kind of indirect tacit approval. But it isn't that way inclined. It's to do with the fact they have no choice. That's how weak they are now.
Yeah, one of the things that people are talking about in the media is the Chinese takeover of the nuclear power stations in the UK.
Well, they're taking them over. No, they may own them, but they're not. It's mere ownership. They want to own the assets. Because they, if I had $3 trillion of worthless paper, I think I'd be dumping it as fast as I possibly could as well.
Yeah, it's like a big monopoly, that's all it is.
And say, I'll buy some assets that I think have some value. But, we come back to people say, well, what's the issue with the whole free energy technology? And it's never going to see the light of day, or is it going to see the light of day? What is it? Well, there was a comment made by Medvedev in Russia, who said, in the not too distant future, Russia will not be economically dependent on oil and gas. Well, what did that say to me? Okay, what's the alternative? They're not going to be economic, so they don't really think oil and gas will have a future. Well, they must think there's alternative technology out there. So, this is not as much to do with trying to say, well, we're not going to have free energy or alternative energy technology in a meaningful way because Russia will not want to lose its oil and gas reserves and these nations. But if there's an alternative, which is coming down the pipe, which they know about, of course they'll acquire assets, and because what's at stake here is the survival of the planet and the removal of the Western cabal. That is far more important than, and by acquiring assets, it doesn't matter whether they have any monetary value or in the future is irrelevant. There's a big plan unfolding, and they're doing everything to destroy the Western cabal and acquiring an asset that maybe in 20 years is worthless doesn't really bother or concern them. It's about the greater, far more serious issue of removing an insane cabal who have taken the world to the edge of oblivion, but failed, fortunately, on several occasions, and now it's no longer a problem.
There was an article that I saw come up on the feed about India investing in free energy technology. Did you see that, Andy?
Yes, I saw that, Tom. I found it very interesting. I'd be curious to know if we can get any more information about that.
Yeah, I saw that also, and I think, there's the Iranian guy Kashi, or however you pronounce his surname, who's supposed to be bringing out these devices that people can buy for $200, and the claim was they're going to be rolled out in a week or so. Well, we'll see what happens. If that happens, then that's going to be a serious hammer blow to the petrochemical industry. But people need to also bear in mind that these alternative energy technology's been around since the age of Tesla. Tesla bought a load of stuff out and all his patents were squashed, and he was effectively rendered bankrupt and penniless, deliberately. This technology does exist, and there are people running it. I've seen someone running their house with so-called free energy technology, not telling anyone about it for obvious reasons. So the technology does exist, it's viable. It's not on a commercial footing, but at some point when the cabal's gone, who've used oil and gas to control nations, to wage war, to ensure that their control mechanism is by strangling the Saudi oil supply and stealing most of the money from a barrel of oil that was sold. Is another reason why it was hugely important to them. When that's gone, and we will start to see the birth of alternative energy technology, but don't be surprised to see Russia and China very much at the forefront of that and already very much involved in it, knowing full well, and maybe why Medvedev said we don't see oil and gas as relevant to our economic future. He wouldn't have said that unless they had some plan to unfold in the future.
Well, then the last 5 minutes, one thing that we didn't touch on, I was talking about the moves of Russia in Syria and inevitably Iraq, maybe Libya, Afghanistan. How does that actually, how does it play out, and how does it affect Saudi Arabia and Israel in the region?
Well, undoubtedly, Saudi Arabia is very weak, and if Saudi loses the influence of the cabal there, then, and very, very quickly, the House of Saud will collapse and fall. And we're seeing already evidence of a struggle for power internally. I think you will see Saudi Arabia fall in the not too distant future. It may be a big catalytic event in that region as the Western influence over nations wanes and the Eastern influence, which is not about control, takes effect. As for Israel, I suspect Israel's been very muted, very quiet. We're not hearing a huge amount coming out from them. I don't expect we will. What happens in the future with Israel, it will be interesting. I don't actually think Netanyahu will stay in power for that much longer. I think we'll see a change of influence. I know a couple of Israeli people who have relatives there who said the Israeli people are sick of what's being done to their nation. There's the whole Palestine question. I think you will start to see subtle influence there to address that problem, which we know is huge and enormously complicated, and that needs addressing. So I do think we'll see the idea of this redrawing of the map of the Middle East by the cabal is now over, and we'll start to see a retraction of their influence, and the Middle East will change. We're already seeing evidence of Dubai in huge financial difficulty. That was clearly a construction that came about through Western influence, when to the detriment of Iran, and as Iran grows stronger and becomes more of a financial centre and economically stronger on a world stage, this is why we're seeing the death of Dubai very quickly. And I think this is another example where you'll see that influence in certain Middle Eastern nations will disappear. So we're going to see a complete reorientation of the Middle East, which will be hugely significant. And Saudi, of course, will be part of that, and also Israel, but not exclusively. I think not only will we see changes in Iraq, Afghanistan, we'll see it across the entire Middle East. Egypt is already changing significantly towards being far less Western sympathetic, in fact not Western sympathetic, and is now aligning itself with Russia and China to some extent, and we'll continue to see that also.
Yeah, we're going to continue to see people aligning with Russia and China rather than the West.
I think so, yeah, and I think undoubtedly that will become more and more commonplace and prevalent.
Did you cover the oil found in the Golan Heights? Didn't even.
No, we didn't discuss. I mean, yes, that's reared its head this week. No surprise why that's a disputed territory. Oil is obviously is still considered to be hugely important, and is not called black gold for nothing. I don't think. I think we'll end up seeing where that disputed territory won't be disputed territory. It's all part of the retraction of Israeli interests in the Middle East. I think we'll see Israel, and once again, this is not about Israeli people. It's about an insane regime that runs the country that is not interested in the Israeli people and has no interest in fomenting anything that's beneficial to that nation or any of its neighbours. But we'll see an end to that also, and I think Golan Heights will be another example where that will change.
I think that's exactly what people are waking up to, the fact that governments are not out for the interests of the people.
No, absolutely, they're not. And when nations suddenly, their government becomes interested in the benefit of their people, overnight you'll see these changes and go, why did they not do this? And then, by that stage, it'll be obvious why they didn't. But we have all these apparent major problems in nations. They are not major problems. They're a really simple solution. The problem is we don't have a government who has any interest in its people.
Mm-hmm. The minute that we've got left, do you want to give out the link to the Facebook page and any other information that you want to give out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's called the Sirius Report. That's SIRIUS. It's on Facebook. It's open to everyone. You can welcome to join, and you can contribute. We currently have a procedure where we moderate things, but we generally post everything that people want to be posted. You'll be part of discussions, ask questions. It's all about understanding and education, and sometimes people will post articles of things I'm not aware of, so it's mutually beneficial. I learn some new things as well, and it gets me to go and look at certain things I'm not being aware of. So that's the process. It's all about everyone educating everyone else to an understanding of what's going on, and obviously in the future what is coming, and how we can all be part of a far better world, which surely is what we all want to aspire to.
Well, thank you very much for coming back on the show, Paul. I'm sure we'll be talking soon on another show. Maybe we'll get somebody to counteract your argument and get a little bit of debate going.
That's fine, yeah, I'd be more than happy to do that, and it's a pleasure as ever to be on the show, and thanks a lot, Tom and Andy.
Please check out the Facebook page. It's Enemy Within Radio, all one word. If you're searching this, best to search enemy_within. It's at Enemy Within Talk, and it's www.enemywithinradio.com. We'll be back tomorrow on Spreaker.com/Enemy Within Radio with Sarah Goodley and Marie McLaughlin. See you later, folks.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Chris and Sheree Gio here, founders of Truth Frequency Radio. We just wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for making TFR the biggest and the best independent radio station out there.
When we first entered the alternative media scene in 2009, we were really taken aback by the amount of infighting, backbiting, fear-based reporting, and ego-driven personalities. That's when we knew we had to set ourselves apart and set a new standard in broadcasting. And thus, TFR was conceived as a listener-supported station with no corporate or outside influence and limited commercial interruptions.
You can support our efforts by signing up for a VIP membership at truthfrequencyradio.com/sign-up or by making a donation at truthfrequencyradio.com/donate.
For less than $4 a month, you can ensure that TFR continues broadcasting for years to come. Real people, real radio.
Wherever you are, make it TFR. And now it's time for comments from our listeners.
Jennifer writes,
I'm confused about the commercial that is on your radio station. It has the thing on the NASA guy saying that he worked in a Jewish area and was fired. What is this about? Only a brain-dead moron would think that joke is funny. I'm going to contact all the Jewish organizations and sue you, your host, your members, and your listeners for $200,000.
Dear Jennifer, our Letters from Our Listeners segment is where we read the most bizarre and craziest emails from listeners. Humor's subjective. We find these segments to be hilarious. Thank you for tuning in to TFR and stay tuned for much more.